Okay, in this tutorial I'm going to help you learn how to answer a question from this section of the checklist, which is how to draw annotated diagrams that describe the properties of podsols, brown earth, forest soils and clay soils. And in this tutorial I'm going to just look at podsols and specifically focus on the idea that you are just describing, not explaining how the soil is formed. If you want to see the question we're actually going to look at, then here you will see question 3. The typical question is to draw and fully annotate a soil profile of a podsol to show its main characteristics, including horizons, color, texture, and drainage. So we've got to make sure we cover all of those things and associated vegetation. So our labels have to make sure they address all of these things. If you want to see a model answer to that question, well, then what you want to do is on the revision website, you will find a model answer in this particular link here. Okay, let's have a look at a podsol first of all. This is the answer you're going to be aiming to do. But before we get to that, let's just have a quick jump back and actually look at what we're looking at. So a podsol tends to be found in cold, wet climates. And it's the soil that lies beneath areas that are often have pine trees, pine forests, or maybe heather moorland that you might find in the Scottish mountains. It tends to be quite a shallow soil because it's forming in colder areas and therefore it's taking longer to develop. It will have a very distinct black O-horizon, that's the humus layer. That's where you find all the decaying pine needles. And then it will have gradually a grayish layer, as we can see here. So this is all the A horizon. Then there will be what's called an iron pan, which is a kind of a reddish layer of iron deposits. And below that, there's this sort of brownish, reddish brown layer. And then at the very bottom, and we can see it in this picture here, we have the parent material. Okay, so that's the soil that we're looking to draw an annotated diagram that describes. If we actually have a look at the diagram you're going to be looking to draw, this is something similar to what you're going to be aiming to draw. First thing you'll notice when you look through some of the points is there is no explanation for why they are the way they are. This question is not an explain question, it is just a describe. So therefore it's relatively easy to navigate. It could be somewhere between 6 to 8 marks, more than likely, and therefore you're going to be looking for 8 comments. Labels, I should say. And in order to get those 8 marks, you're also going to have to make sure the labels cover the main parts of the question, which were, reference to the vegetation, the climate, the texture of the soil, the horizons, and so on. So let's just navigate our way through this question. First thing, it's drawing the actual diagram. Now, how to draw a good diagram is to draw a long, not too wide, but reasonably wide so you can get some of the key labels in, a rectangle. You're not going to want to divide it simply into 3 parts. You're going to want to make the A horizon quite small and then just shade in this area here a bit thicker. Make the B horizon much bigger and then draw a line for the C. Now the C is actually very deep and it tends to be quite a big horizon, but it largely doesn't contain much information, so we've just made this quite small in our diagram. Once you've done the A, you will want to separate off the top part of the A to indicate that there is a layer above it, which is often what we call the O horizon. It's the humus layer, which is where the leaves and pine needles and things that fall on the ground are gradually decaying. Okay. Then to your diagram, you're going to add a picture of a pine tree, maybe something indicating rain coming down, and you'll want some roots, but you want to make sure the roots of the trees don't go too deep. We can see that here. Okay. Now let's, final bit we should say is make sure you name this A, B, C, and that you indicate this is ash grey, this layer here is reddish brown, and you might want to put this is weathered to parent material. You don't need colour to do this, as long as your labels do the talking for you. Right, what are the key labels? Well, let's go to the top and start at the top of the soil. Our vegetation is coniferous forest and heather moorland. That's all we need to say. That's a purely descriptive statement. If we were being asked to explain it, then we would say because it's a colder climate or it's a mountainous climate where these soils are found, and therefore this is the type of vegetation that can survive in those climates. But as this is a describe question, that is not the next step we need to do. So you'll notice on none of my labels have I got any explanations. I've indicated it's cold, wet climate. The key point here is that I want to bring in this idea of leaching. That means that the rainwater is leaching downwards into the soil, and there's very little coming back up through evaporation. So leaching is the dominant force in the soil. Unlike the brown earth, if you watch the video, you will see that there is a two-way process of water going down as well as water coming up. Up here we have our O horizon. That's the very thin, maybe about a centimeter or two thick, very black humus layer, and it's thin. We also have this layer is very acidic, and it's often known as a moor humus. So you could put both of those facts in. You could even name the pH of the moor humus, which you'll find in your notes. The A horizon is ash grey colour, so you want to make sure you've got that label. Additional mark can be coming from telling me that the A horizon has a sandy texture. So if you were going to rub it between your fingers, it would feel quite sandy. The top of the A horizon is different from the bottom. The top of the A horizon tends to be a bit darker because the black color from the O horizon is washing downwards, and means that it starts off very black and then gets slightly darker gray, and then gradually as you move down the A horizon becomes this lighter ash gray color. Moving down, between our A and our B, we have an iron pan developing between these two layers. You don't need to explain why that's the case. And if we look at this label, because we have this iron pan, you don't get much downward movement. Sorry, over here, this label, not much downward movement of water. So drainage is poor, and that means that A horizon is probably going to get waterlogged because a lot of water is not draining down further down into the soil, which is why it's much drier down here. A lot of it's getting trapped by the iron pan. Over here, we've got a label that talks about the lack of biota. These are the living organisms in soil that move around the soil and break down the organic matter. They travel throughout the soil from the bottom all the way to the top. So a worm, for example, is a good example of this. Because there's very little of it, there's not much moving up and down through the soil, and therefore the soil is not mixing, which is why we get some very distinct cut-off layers. And if I just jump back a page, you will see from our diagram what we mean by having very distinct layers. There you can see the grayish layer, you can see the iron pan layer, you can see the reddish brown B horizon, and at the top you can see the very dark O humus layer. So they're all very visible. In a brown earth, you wouldn't be able to see them so distinct because you've got this continual leaching as well as movement up of water through evaporation, creating this capillary action. You've also got worms moving and other organisms moving up and down through the soil, mixing it. Okay, let's just finish off our diagram. A few other things you can say. We've got this reddish B horizon. The B horizon is much denser and it might be wet. Move further down, we've got the point about the lack of mixing. We have our C horizon finally, which is what we call the parent material. This is where the soil actually began thousands of years ago. And this would have been the bottom layer actually back before the soil formed. And this parent material has to be weathered by nature. So things like freeze thaw and other chemical weathering processes are breaking this rock down, releasing the minerals which the soil then develops on. But obviously you don't need to say that because that's explanation. So all you need to do is tell us that the C horizon is made up of parent material, but most specifically made up of weathered rock. That's where you get the mark. You could also, for an additional mark, say that often, especially in Scotland, the C horizon is made up from rocks that have been deposited by the melting glaciers at the end of the last ice age. So about a metre beneath our feet across Scotland, if we were to move the soil, we'd find all of these rocks that had been dropped there by the glaciers when they melted. And there you have it. You've got more labels on this diagram than you would need. So when you're practicing, rehearsing this, I would practice, draw out your diagram, see if you can memorize the diagram and replicate it without looking at it, and then see if you can add at least 8 diagrams, labels to the correct locations on the diagram, or broadly speaking, and that would get you full marks.